All right. Welcome back. Please take your seats. We are now ready to conduct our third and final plenary session. As I mentioned, this session is focused on the defense industrial base and national security. The moderator of this panel is Dr. Vic Ramdes. He currently serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for Industrial Base Policy. In this critical role, he helps lead the Department of War's efforts to develop and maintain a resilient and resourceful and secure defense industrial base. Many of you in this audience know Dr. Ramdes from his previous assignments and roles within the sustainment community. His leadership and the expertise on this panel are not just here to discuss the challenges, they're here to talk about the solutions that will define our industrial advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Vic Ramdes and the Defense Industrial Base panel members.
Thank you, Fred. Appreciate it. Awesome. Good morning. All right, we got to get really enthused here, right? All right. Hey, thank you, Pat, and appreciate your flexibility in doing the jump from Kentucky to here in Phoenix. I know that was not a little lift, so great work by the team. Really exciting time to be in the industrial base. Whether you're in working at a grassroots or you're here where we are with policy. How many of you here today listened to the Vice Chairman's speech? Okay, your clairvoyance, ubiquity, perpetual capabilities, right? It felt like as a Marine, you want to be able to take that hill, right? You're motivated. Today, I want to focus on, you will see as we kick this off and as I set the stage, there's no daylight between the Joint Staff and the Office of Secretary of War. I would like to think about the single most important challenge we face, forging an industrial base that is not only efficient in peacetime, but resilient and dominant. The Vice mentioned a nation that can outlast our adversaries. He spoke about endurance. That's what I want us to think about. Forging an industrial base that is not only efficient, but resilient and dominant. One which can enable the endurance the Vice talked about. For decades, we treated this challenge as an efficiency problem, optimized for peacetime, built on just-in-time inventory and delivery. That era is over. In the next conflict, victory wouldn't hinge on the platforms we have on day one, but on our ability to regenerate combat power under fire. And today, our industrial enterprise, commercial partners, whether it's the commercial industrial base or the organic industrial base, are not built for that fight. That's not a criticism, it's a fact. And it's one that should motivate all of us. It should be a call for action. You should be motivated to do and make a difference. The department is answering that call with historic investments. My slides up? And there we go. As you look on this slide, whether it's Defense Production Act investment or industrial base fund to reshape our industrial posture, we're investing billions in munitions, critical minerals, components like solid rocket motors. We're expanding our domestic production and building a true mine-to-foxhole, mine-to-magnet, rare earth supply chain. These are warfighting investments, and we expect warfighting returns. Department of War leaders have been clear. Production is deterrence. That is the outcome we demand, an industrial base that deters. Again, the Vice talked about deterrence earlier today. Achieving this requires a shift to wartime production, the core of the department's acquisition transformation strategy. The strategy is a mandate. It's not a memo. It's not a piece of paper. It requires industry to accelerate capability, engineer resilient production, and adopt a digital-first approach. This is what partnership in national defense looks like. The blueprint exists. Now we must move from declaration to execution. The work has begun. Now we must scale and we must accelerate. The panel before you, and I really thank you for taking the time to be here today, represents commercial industry, but the questions ahead are for all of us. They cut across the private sector and our organic industrial base, and we'll address them directly. How do we eliminate bureaucratic drag that slows us down? How do we break down barriers? How do we build supply chains that can absorb the next disruption and the one after that? And where must government, industry, and allies take smart risk and co-invest now to deliver for the warfighter in 2027, not 2037? So let's begin that work. I'm thrilled to welcome our distinguished panelists. We have Jerry McGinn, immediate to my left here, bringing the strategic policy from CSIS. There we go. We have Nathan Ruiz, who has the data perspective from Govini. From Apex Defense, a leader in acquisition reform, Alexis Ross, and she's no stranger to the Hill or Department of War. And from the front lines of industry, we have Sarah Cooney of Honeywell and Kendall Loomis of Raytheon. While I encourage you to read their extensive bios in the Symposium app, what's truly important is the decades of real-world operational experience, grassroots experience that they bring to this stage. So without further ado, let's begin with a question to Jerry from a strategic policy perspective. So from a policy standpoint, Jerry, what are the top 2 structural failures preventing the DIB from scaling at the speed the Secretary demands, and what can be done about it?
Well, thanks again, Vic, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you and all of the operators here in the audience in the Maintenance Symposium. I would think that the first big structural challenge, you alluded to it, and specifically when you talk about efficiencies and the like, it's how the department buys. So the department buys for terms of specific contracts to meet specific requirements. And industry responds to address those requirements. And they build to the spec of those contracts and nothing more, because that's what they're incentivized to do, is to those contracts. And that is the system we've created, and companies, do it as efficiently and effectively as possible to get their maximum profit and deliver the effectiveness and to the warfighter, and the government wants the lowest unit cost as well. So the challenge of that is that approach works okay when you're in a peacetime environment, but if you want to surge, you got nothing, right? You have no slack in the system, no ability to produce at scale, which the Secretary is talking about. So speed is important, but it is not enough. And that's where, to get scale, you need to change how you buy. And that gets to my second structural point, which has been talked about. It's almost become overused or overdetermined, and that's the demand signal. And so the demand signal, what it means by that is, at essence, it is a contract, right? A contract is what will really get companies to produce. But there are ways you can really strengthen that demand signal because we did some analysis looking at munitions buys over time. And prior to COVID even, looking at the 20 years prior to that, and there was up to 50% year-over-year change on munitions buys as budgets changed, as needs changed. And if you're a program manager and your munitions budget, drops by 50% or so, that gives you great uncertainty. Likewise, if you're at Raytheon up in Tucson, you don't know what to plan for. So we have to stop that to the degree we can and build more predictability into buys. And that is through things such as multi-year procurement, which I know that the Congress has been cooperative on a number of areas, but we could do more of that. It is doing longer-term agreements like the negotiation you did with Mountain Pass for a 10-year offtake agreement, right? So if you want companies to have that demand signal, you've got to give them some time. So setting longer-term agreements, creating incentives to help private capital invest more of their money. Some government-backed loans, like such you're doing through Office of Strategic Capital, or private sector loans, or accelerated depreciation. These are the kind of things that can help change that demand signal to really help industry and government achieve the scale we need.
And much of those buys we do enables a very efficient and effective supply chain. So Nathan, what role can technology innovation play, not just to identify problems in the supply chain, but to fix them and make the warfighting logistics system work better?
Thank you for the question, Vic, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today addressing this distinguished audience. I think, just to be a little provocative out of the gate here, I think one of the biggest suggestions I would make is we need to stop talking about scrim. And I think, I'm not suggesting we kill it, but probably should start planning the funeral. And what I mean by that is let's stop talking about it as an acronym, as a bureaucratic process, as a standalone tool and capability, because I think doing a report on why a widget came out of China or a component producer that has a financial risk that we need to be aware of is totally fine. I think that is ultimately meaningless if it doesn't tie back to the investments that you referenced, that Jerry mentioned, IBAS, I think Defense Production Act, OSC. It's making those investments both on the production side as well as the sustainment side. And I think taking a more holistic view of the critical supply chain component. I think the main challenge right now for us is orchestrating across different programs, supply chains across the enterprise. It's not enough to just identify a choke point. We also have to plan on how we're going to avoid that. And ultimately, we need the data and the site picture, I think, to draw from, since we are drawing from the same underlying industrial base, we need to understand the trade-offs at the systems level, the tactical level, the service level. So I think what we also want to do is, for example, enable folks to get out with a defense unique part. High demand, low density, for example. What are the commercial alternatives, for example, that already exist in another part of the industrial base? Maybe outside of what the DoW is already engaging with, but in the American industrial base. I think once you've done that, you can then say, what allows us to systematize that and take some of the personal heroics that a lot of folks in this room are responsible for and systemize it in a way that's actually repeatable and quicker to action. I think that's a key component. As Undersecretary Duffy has noted, and you mentioned, Vic, at the start, the digitization of the entire acquisition process is long overdue. And I think if we think about it less as a sort of tool bag and more as an attempt to put together an acquisition operating system, something that's holistic, I think there's three components to what goes into that. I think first, you need best-in-class AI-powered commercial software. Second, you need to not just centralize it in the Pentagon or give it to one vendor and sort of walk away, but you also need to, third, enable the data from industry, from the OEMs to flow through, whether that's bills of material, blueprints. The government needs to have access to that data in order to make the best decisions. I think this drives, in closing, two impacts. The first is squeezing all of the capability out of the industrial base as it exists right now for our warfighters, undersized as it might be. And second, I think effectively, again, coming back to that investment piece, effectively guiding those investments and helping us make informed trade-offs.
Great, thank you. So Alexis, as you respond to the next question, I want you to also weave in some of the technology aspects of what Nathan just talked about. So what is one way, an achievable, tangible thing we can do right now to better integrate commercial and the organic industrial base, right? Bridge those two together to really drive meaningful outcomes.
Okay, well, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. Always enjoy spending time with logisticians. Okay, so on technology, so riffing off of what Nathan had said. If there's one thing that could be done to integrate the commercial industrial base and the organic industrial base and to try to achieve the production capacity that the Secretary and the administration is pushing so hard for right now, If I had to pick one thing, I would say that we need a strong digital ecosystem, like the ones that the commercial companies are using, essentially. So, in fact, Jerry and I were just at a tabletop exercise. We spent the whole day doing a tabletop exercise yesterday at CSIS on increasing, surge capacity in manufacturing in a time of war, and how would you surge that, and running through this war game as you get through the different phases. You get to the final phase, and you're like, what? Of course, then they ask you to go back and look at what you should have done at phase 0 at the beginning today to prepare for all of the things that you need to do at the time. And I kept thinking back to everything that we wanted to do to increase manufacturing capacity and to be able to put out more supplies and material, all required some sort. It would have worked much better if we had today implemented a digital ecosystem where you can connect the OEMs to the department, to forward units that might want to print a part, to depots for repair and overhaul, and in a time of real extreme circumstances, an additional entity, a contract manufacturer, a commercial sector like the automotive industry, something where you can send to them the digital framework, the digital information that they would need in order to be able to produce in a massive scale. So we've been talking a lot in the last, and it really goes even beyond or before the department's acquisition reform initiatives to increase the capacity in the industrial base. But I've noticed in the last year or so a great interest in reindustrialization. There's a lot of funding and financing coming into the space. There's a lot of startups and tech coming in and for manufacturing. And I think one of the key pieces that if you're going to accomplish reindustrialization, you're going to have to do, the department is going to have to get on board with digital transformation. And it's not just digitizing information. It's not just software tools. It's a complete change to how we approach things and the workflows and the automating tasks and all of those things. And so if you're able to truly integrate the different elements of the apparatus that we have that we can bring to bear, we would absolutely need some sort of integrated digital ecosystem.
Yeah, I think what Alexis highlighted there is the complexity of the challenge we're facing with. So, Sarah, and you can riff off of that as well,
Yeah,
but in doing so also weave in a response to manufacturing is very important, right, to drive some of this increased production and acceleration we're talking about. So what do you see in terms of fragility of the domestic manufacturing system right now, and obviously riff off of?
Yes, so before I go into the fragility portion, I want to piggyback on some of the technology capabilities here. The digital framework is absolutely necessary for the demand planning and the sharing of the resource loading, but there needs to be a baseline expectation for the organic industry in terms of interchanging with the commercial industry. Things like NADCAP certification, AS 9100, quality standards, training levels, work instructions. There is that baseline that doesn't have to wait for this digital infrastructure. I know there's several key organic industrial base sites that have made those steps to become NADCAP or AS 9100. That's opened up additional opportunities for public-private partnerships and those capabilities. So I agree completely in the need for the digital transformation, but we can't overlook the fact that there are some very basics in manufacturing that have to be adopted. And I think the panel this morning talked about that requirement to modernize our organic industrial base. And some of that is needing to meet current industry standards. So when you ask me about fragility and in terms of the entire manufacturing, I think our fragileness right now is due to the unprecedented demand that's occurring both in the commercial industry and the defense industry. I don't know that most folks are actually here locally. You probably all traveled on some form of a commercial airline. It's worth noting that by the year 2044, it is predicted that we will double the amount of air traffic, which means we're going to increase the number of airframes carrying all of you all over the place by roughly 50,000 aircraft. And so when we talk about what is fragile in this industry, in manufacturing to support the defense needs and the commercial needs, it comes down to your resources. It's that tier 3, 4, 5 level that is supporting both defense and commercial. It is your forging, your machining, your raw materials, and your people. When we look at where we need to be recruiting more across the board, it comes down at the end of the day to people. And are we bringing up the next generation in the terms of, hey, manufacturing's cool? And that's where we'll probably spend a little bit more time, with future questions is what do we do about that and how do we overcome the fragility beyond the activities that's happening? Okay, raw materials, forging, the Forge Act, reducing legislation, those are all great. We can't forget the people.
Thanks, Sarah. And for the audience, really would like some questions related to the workforce, or if you have solutions to that as well. Kendall, Sarah just talked about that, the dichotomy there, the competing interests with, commercial, military requirements. So this question I pose to you probably aligns to some of that as well, or at least one of the contributing problems. But where are primes still unable to meet, why are they unable to meet surge requirements? And what is the single biggest bottleneck you can solve without government assistance or support?
Thank you. Difficult question to answer, right? How do we surge and where's the constraint? So I'm going to cheat and tell you my answer, and I appreciate where Vic started off with. One of our biggest constraints is single-year contracting. We invest and we ask our supply base to invest based on the contracts that are in front of us, the secured work that we have. We plan and we see and we think we know what's coming, but that changes. And so we struggle to invest for surge and hiring people and investing in manufacturing space. And it's even harder for us to get our supply base to want to invest without the formality of contracting and the known work in front of us. So our biggest ask is multi-year contracts, which give us some runway and a business case to go ramp. In the last 24 months, Raytheon has invested $1.2 billion, our own internal profit, $1.2 billion in our internal infrastructure, in test equipment, in manufacturing footprint, in IRAD projects, in obsolescence, in modernization of the factories, all of those kinds of things. And that gives us efficiencies and growth, but it does not meet the surge demands that in the last 6 months are being put in front of us. So when we look at surging, 2 swim lanes we really track. One is the supply base, because 75% of the cost of a missile and the majority of our effort is in parts that we buy. And then the other swim lane obviously is manufacturing, our own integration and test facilities, and what are we doing to ramp and modernize those. Within the supply base, and we've touched on it, and I appreciate the previous comments, when we look at fragility, we look at it across the defense industrial base. So we are looking at who is Raytheon buying from, who is Lockheed buying from, who is Boeing buying from, and when we're all ramping, who are we really ultimately pinching? And then to Sarah's point, as you go down in that supply base and you get to castings and forgings and semiconductors and raw materials and energetics specifically, where are the constraints in that base? We looked at it across the United States from a geographic standpoint. Where are those suppliers located? Where are we pinching the workforce? What is the education level of folks? Where do we need to invest in growing the next generation of people? We look at places like Camden, Arkansas, where you've got Raytheon and Lockheed and Aerojet, and you've got this tiny little town, and everybody is trying to now surge, and we're all trying to hire the same workforce. So what is an alternative solution to all of us competing in Camden, Arkansas? So there are layers within the supply base that we are trying to address. It's not just how do we get more parts from Honeywell. You guys have all seen, I'm sure, what's going on with L3 in the news and where the US government is investing directly in trying to create a prime supplier to the defense contractors and add growth and capability. So I would say overarching, we are trying to look at the fragility of our tier 1 suppliers, where we need to invest with them, and in their non-competing industrial bases. We are looking at geography and where suppliers are located, and how do we kind of spread that out so that we have a we minimize the people resource constraint. And then we are looking internally into our own factories. Where do we have obsolescence issues with test equipment? And where do we have opportunities to modernize factories, to automate, and bring in kind of alternative solutions? Those are how we're tackling the problem in this underarching umbrella constraint of single-year contracting.
Thanks, Kendall.
Can I add a single little point here to add on to the point she made about multi-year procurements and sort of a recommendation for the department? There has been a lot of work being done, really good work that I would like to laud, to try to increase the industrial base and to try to increase capacity. And much of what's happening is sort of carrots and sticks that are out there that have come out recently. And one of the great sweeteners is multi-year procurement and longer contracts. And so the expectation that the department wants industry to invest their own capital. And so in exchange, we'll give you multi-year contracts. Here's the recommendation. I would recommend that the department continue, as hard as it is, to work with Congress to get those multi-year procurements, because as many of you know, or if you don't know, those things have to be both authorized and appropriated. And so you're dealing with, 4 separate committees in Congress, which can be a real challenge. And the deal kind of falls apart if the multi-year procurement aspect of this doesn't come through. And so that can be a bit of a challenge, and I think that's something that it's a government to government kind of a thing, and it's hard for industry to sort of step in and lobby for that. That's something that the department will have to continue to work through, as hard as it is. I was an authorizer, so I can say that those appropriators, they don't like to fund those things very much, but somebody understands, somebody feels me. All right, thanks.
Yeah. Any other comments on that? Before we get to the acquisition transformation strategy, I just want to pull the thread a little on the workforce, especially given Kendall just talked about the manufacturing pieces and the challenges they're having in terms of competing for each other's workforce. So, Sarah, if you would, how do we build critical workforce skills at the speed required for our national security? And then I would ask the rest of the panelists to think about that as well.
Honeywell is probably no different than many other the large OEMs in terms of trying to recruit and hire. We actually start as early as kindergarten. We have programs that reach out to our K-12 schools. We have programs that work with the community colleges. Those of you that are from the local area may have seen in the last year, we've partnered with folks like the Phoenix Suns and Mercury and the Cardinals to do community outreach for STEM, because we believe that those early phases of education are exactly where you need to grow your workforce. They're not going to come to us ready. We have to encourage that learning to happen. So some of the things that we actually do is to work with the local schools in terms of making sure that the curriculum they're offering is actually applicable. We do a fair number of internships and partnering to ensure hands-on learning scenarios. We actually also guide students. We do a fair amount of mentoring. We're very strong with that in our engineering programs in several universities throughout the US and actually internationally as well, which is probably not as pertinent to this audience. But it's a global approach that we take in terms of trying to encourage our new generation to come into manufacturing and into science and technology. I'm sure you have some of the same examples, Kendall.
Any thoughts?
I think we could certainly take a page from the European model, which is where I spend a lot of time looking, and the integration with the large manufacturing companies over there and the schools in terms of even students working half days and then as young as 14, 15, and 16 spending half days inside the suppliers is amazing. But we personally do it on several levels as well. And we are located in Tucson, Arizona. I mean, you talk about a manufacturing constraint. We've got 16,000 employees 2 hours down the road. Tucson is the main heart of all of missile production that comes out of Raytheon. And we work with the local community colleges. We have in Arizona a great JTED program, which is kind of a alternative program in the high schools for trades. And we spend a significant amount of money working with JTED and the high school students, bringing them in and getting them familiar with what the opportunities and what growth looks like inside the company. So I think Sarah's right. You have to tap into it at all levels. But we don't it's still an internally funded effort. You know, when you look at Europe, it's funded by the government. You know, so there's a larger overarching reach. We're one company trying to tap into it. I'm sure Lockheed is the same way, Honeywell is the same way. We're all kind of doing our own individual piece, but it's not as strong collectively as it could be if we really addressed this on a larger scale.
And just for the audience, just the Department of War is working very closely with Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs and a number of similar organizations to really destigmatize manufacturing jobs and blue-collar jobs. Any other additional comments on workforce? Well, let's pivot to acquisition transformation strategy. And Jerry, which parts of the new acquisition strategy are not being implemented with the urgency required, and why?
I think that's a very kind of provocative question for you to ask. I mean, because when did the Secretary Hegseth make his speech? It was in November.
In November, yeah.
Right, it was 2 months ago. So, so 2 months it's hard to grade somebody on 2 months, you know, even in government. So I have to pivot a little bit. But I guess I would say one of the aspects, the Secretary laid out 3 kind of major areas. The big top section was on acquisition, but he also talked about security cooperation, and he talked about requirements. So the Secretary disestablished the Joint Capability Integration Development System, or JCIDS, last summer, in the kind of June, I think, of 2025. And I don't think we've seen anything from that since then in terms of results. So, and you know, I think the desire was to make requirements less cumbersome, more value add, more tied to the warfighter, more tied to have industry more engaged, and all those principles are excellent. But we haven't seen anything since that announcement. I'm sure they're working very hard on it. But you know, getting industry and getting kind of folks engaged on that, I think would be helpful for us, for the department to do.
Thank you. Nathan.
Sure.
The overriding priority of Department of War's acquisition transformation is time. Until recently, scheduled shared equal billing or even trailed cost and performance. No longer. How do we manage supply chains in ways that accelerate the sustainment, and in particular, MRO?
MRO is a topic near and dear to my heart. I would say, in particular, when we look at the units of efficacy, how it's measured, I think it's moved from months and weeks to hours. I think decisions need to be made about resupply, about maintenance, much faster. I think it's built on some of what I talked about earlier in terms of the right AI-powered software capability, the right access to data. But a practical example, shout out to the Coast Guard, would be where I've seen junior logistics management specialists logging on, finding alternatives, commercial alternatives, instead of slogging through a Navy procurement system. Sorry, Navy, for what could be months, they're able to find and source and make a decision. So I think speed to market research, building in that risk mitigation, I think measuring that in minutes and hours is part of the way we do that. I think it's obviously built on, again, getting out of the heroic sort of mentality of individual effort and points of individual effort being the thing we have to depend on. I think obviously we appreciate that effort, but we want it to be more codified, and we want to make it something that's more sustainable and scalable. And so I think it has to be more systemic and built on that digital ecosystem that we've been referring to.
Mm-hmm.
So this is probably near and dear to many in the audience's heart. Right to repair. It's a hot topic. How does the department effectively obtain greater access to IPLXs?
I'll jump on that. Okay. Yeah, this is a pretty contentious issue. I've been working in acquisition for years. This has always been one of the most contentious issues, and you guys in this room understand why. I think there is a way for the department to get more access to IP and also achieve the goals that are also in the acquisition strategy, reform strategy, and the goals that the department is trying to obtain right now, namely broadening the industrial base, bringing more entrants in, having access to commercial companies and private capital-backed firms. And I think the way to do that is to be thinking about things in terms of access versus delivery, because we have a tendency, or we have had a tendency to think about things in terms of you contract for the delivery of IP. It's a very static, those contract deliverables, they tend to be very static. It's often artifacts that have to be updated and maintained. And we don't have a lot of that skill set inside the department often to be able to keep that up to date. It becomes obsolete. It's expensive to do it that way, not just to try to keep it up to date, but to also buy it, license it really up front like that. And so for whatever open-ended purpose you might need. So I would recommend something that's also a transformational and very reform-oriented way of managing IP, which is, some people are calling it IP as a service, some people are calling it data as a service, whether you call it like a subscription-based thing or a lease-based thing, that essentially it comes down to a scenario where an OEM and the department come up with a framework. They agree upon a framework whereby the IP and the software would be available for maintenance or repair and accessible at any time, but the department only has to pay for it if and when it actually downloads it and uses it for the repair or the manufacturer. And so this is not a wild concept, and we have been talking about this for a while, but we haven't actually done it. And so I think the table is set to do it. We have a lot of reasons for that right now. And so it's also not that inconceivable. It's an everyday occurrence. We stream videos all the time. And when you stream a video, you're basically having access to IP for a specified number of views or a number of days, and at which time it eventually then turns off. And the owner of the IP is compensated. So it's a new way of thinking about IP. It changes the business model. It still enables some revenue stream to be obtained or earned from the creator of the IP, but the department has it in a more accessible, agile fashion. And I know that sometimes there's concerns about this from industry, but I think that we can protect and manage the IP really well in this kind of a scenario. It's not unheard of to do things like end-to-end encryption, and also to make sure that whatever platform or ecosystem, digital ecosystem you're using to collect and manage and store and move around this IP, make sure, I mean, you could be doing things, there's new things that are being done now where you would have the ability for the OEM to essentially send it and stream it to an individual like unit or depot, and that individual line of code could then be automatically deleted after its use, and so its intended use. And so you could manage this in a way that's achievable. And the best thing is, it is achievable because there are, commercial products that actually do this. So I think that's the way to go.
Sarah, you clearly have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I do.
Sarah, and then I'll come to you, Jerry.
Several of you may know that Honeywell actually has a very large public-private partnership with Hill Air Force Base for all the secondary power equipment in the Air Force. And it is an IP transfer. It's been in place for, decade and a half. So we've done this before. We've done the stand-up and the training and the sharing of the work instructions. The right to repair is a really sexy phrase. But you have to get into the details to understand who is going to own it, who's going to manage it, who's going to keep it updated. I have other examples where the government already owns all the IP on a product. But over the years, because the tech data was never updated, it wasn't kept up to commercial standards, it took a significant amount of effort to get all of that data back up and refreshed. So getting access to the IP is really not the hard part. It's the who is going to manage it, who is going to keep it updated, who is going to have oversight on how it's used, and who is going to train the individuals in the proper application of that IP. And I'm not quite sure, as much as I would love to say, hey, go Air Force as a veteran, I'm not sure we have that infrastructure in place yet to do what is wanted to be done from that really sexy, do I have right to repair, and can I do something in the field?
This one clearly got a lot of attention, because Jerry, and then I'll come to you, Ken.
Yeah, no, this was a big fight during the National Defense Authorization Act negotiations. Some secretaries have spoken about this, but it's really kind of defining your terms, a lot of it. And I think there's been a lot more focus in the last decade on the department side to be a better consumer of IP, a purchaser of IP, and that is the right approach. The government needs to define what capabilities it needs with regard to intellectual property, and then find the license mechanisms to do that. And the best way to do that is upfront. I think there are models like Alexis talks about where data as a service, where we can get there, but we need to stop conflating talking about things that are not necessarily the right to repair and get to the specific issues. And Alexis and I actually talked about this in an upcoming episode of my video series, which is called All About the Base, which will be coming out next month.
Shameless plug, Jerry.
Shameless
Love
plug,
it.
I know. But it's a critical issue, but it's really about defining the terms and getting after it in a methodical kind of way so the government industry can achieve mutually beneficial outcomes.
Right.
And Kendall?
So I just wanted to add one more kind of variable to all of this, and that is the international aspect of MRO. In conflict, and you think about our Patriot air defense system is deployed around the world. It's helping Ukraine in the fight today. It's all over Europe. The recent engagements in CENTCOM. The last thing that the U.S. Army wants to do is have to send equipment all the way back to the U.S. for repair and for issues. And so how do we leverage our international partners that we have given repair capability to reduce the cycle time and increase the operational readiness of equipment that's deployed internationally? That's one of the things that we're looking at is a regional MRO strategy that allows us to partner and create capability not only for our international allies, but also for our U.S. military that's deployed in remote locations and with their hardware around the world. How are we addressing this complexity of keeping our own systems operational in region?
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to pivot now to questions from the audience. So we have a number of them here, but tying to the IP piece, and when will OEM put realistic prices on technical data? And I'm looking at the two at the end, and perhaps Govini as well, but maybe Raytheon or Honeywell. Okay.
Boy, that's an interesting question. And maybe I'll tackle it as a commercial company that supplies mostly dual-use parts to the military. Our pricing is based upon market value. It has to pass through commercial item justification. It has to pass through fair and reasonable. There are a plethora of government guidelines in terms of what is an allowable, acceptable price. So I guess my question to the asker would be, did you not have any of that evidence? Because as a large company, we have to comply with all of that. And so I think there's enough regulations already, even on commercial products, that define that what is priced is what is considered to be market comparable.
It's an area we struggle with when we work with companies like Honeywell who produce a ton of commercial items that have minimal requirements, lower level of quality, lifetime, other issues. And then we come in and we pile onto the table a whole bunch of additional restrictions and requirements and temperatures and lifetime and all of these things. And then we want to control their margin on top of it because our margin is being controlled. And so we're a small fish in the big commercial world when it comes to procuring defense articles from commercial companies. And we complicate their lives in many ways. We want traceability and we add security. We have, ITAR restrictions and we have security restrictions. We require them sometimes to set up separate networks to control data and access and who within the company can even be out on the production line at certain times. And so we come in with all of these constraints, and then we expect a company like Honeywell to bend over backwards to sell IMUs to us because we're helping the U.S. military. And so we recognize the delicate relationship that we have to develop with our prime suppliers who live in both worlds, both defense and commercial. With the Raytheon merger a couple of years ago, it's very interesting. Raytheon historically has been a defense company. We develop defense products, our margins are controlled, everything is disclosed to the U.S. government. here comes Collins and Pratt & Whitney, talk about airplanes, right? Every part on that airplane, for the most part, they're Pratt engines and they're Collins interiors. And so our other business units and now our CEO and president have a very commercial mindset. And they come and look at Raytheon and say, well, what do you mean you're not at a 25% profit margin? And how are we going to, to understand the constraints of working with the U.S. government has been very interesting in this new environment for us, where we are now both a commercial and a defense business. And I think to Sarah's point, right, we are a publicly traded company. We have responsibility to our shareholders. At the end of the day, in order for all of us to have jobs and deliver hardware to the U.S. government, we have to make a profit. And so there is a fine line we walk in these year-over-year, annual contracting. How are we controlling pricing? How are we maintaining delivery schedules and still not ending up in the red?
So I'll give a very good example. People go, well, how complicated is it, not just for a second-tier supplier, but the third and fourth and fifth and that small business that wants to supply to us, and we flow down the FARs and DFARs. Did you all know that there's a DFAR that says, as a compliant government supplier, I have to make sure to give every single one of my company employees training on how to put on their seatbelt and to remind them to wear their seatbelt when they're driving? I'm not kidding. That's one of the DFARs. So imagine the cost that I now have to incur to make sure I develop a training program that not only flows that out on an annual basis, but then makes sure that I track every single one of my employees has taken that training. And then all of those employees have to again go deduct however many minutes, the 10, 15, 20 minutes, against my company overhead so that they took that training. And that's just one of the DFARs.
So I'll pivot to another question here and tie in a couple of things. Does the increasing complexity of systems, F-35, Standard missiles, some of our other exquisite platforms, and this also ties into supply chain, really lend itself to significant DIB expansion and surge production? And if you think through the lens of even mobilization, right, as a commercial industrial base, and leveraging, auto facilities, et cetera, right? Any thoughts? I'll go to Terry and then I'll go.
This is a topic I've thought a lot about, written about. I wrote a report on called Before the Balloon Goes Up, looking at industrial mobilization. And some of the fundamental challenges of facing mobilization are how we build systems. We, essentially our precision-guided munitions, they're built individually, individual programs, individual supply chains, very, very kind of exquisite capabilities, and a lot of these are handmade, right? So surging those in the current kind of model doesn't really work. And so what you're seeing is actually the Air Force has got this initiative called the Family of Affordable Munitions, or FAM. What's about how do we get more producibility in the design of systems, so you have less supply chain gaps, you have more ability to do parts across. And so this is, I think, an important kind of initiative, and I'd like to see much more of that for across the services. So that's going to be how we get from these kind of, you're always going to need exquisite capabilities, but this is how we get to more producibility at scale.
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think that's absolutely right and agree with what you said. I think from our perspective, what we've seen at Govini is the importance of that visibility across the industrial base. So using things like form, fit, function, plain English search terms, what are you looking for? What do you need to find out in industry? Because I think ultimately it breaks down to components, systems. People are looking for the right material and the right part. I think when it comes to scale, I think it gets back to some of the questions around investment from a deterrence standpoint, leaning more into the denial. You mentioned the Air Force, denial versus dominance. I think thinking about which systems you want to use, how you want to scale that production. I think that gets back to some of what you mentioned earlier when it comes to tapping industry as it stands right now. And so I think connecting the data and understanding what industry is capable of right now and where those points exist is critical to getting a start-off point.
Great. Sarah, did you have a comment or? Okay. This is, I think, a good one. Earlier today, Vo Device and the early panel talked a lot about data, and we've been talking about data. So the question here from the audience is data equal and a number of dollar signs, right? Lots of money. What will it take to incentivize industry to adopt standards that allow sharing information in a common way with the government and other industry partners? Lenny, would Raytheon share your information with Lockheed Martin, right?
Well, we've got a lot of situations where we're competimates, is what we call them, right? We're competitors, but we're also partners on development of activities. We do that with Javelin. We do it. We've got Boeing folks sitting on site with us, so we do it internationally. We've got a lot of international competimates where we're co-producing with MBDA in Germany, but at the same time we're competing with them on their international products. And so, it's a tricky question. Yes, I think we've got to be able to share data. We've got to figure out how we do it with the up-and-coming Andurils of the world, right? And how do we collectively find and protect our own swim lanes while still being able to collaborate and move faster together. And I think you see it in pockets. It would probably be worthwhile for us to take a look at some specific examples where we've had success and think about how we build a larger model around that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Go ahead.
I'd reframe it a little bit. So, each company, their IP, their data, their intellectual property, that's their secret sauce. That's what differentiates your products, right? And I don't think the government needs to get into that as much. What the government needs is the ability to be able to achieve different effects and to change vendors when they're not having the effects they want, and so on. So, and this is the whole idea of modular open systems approaches. So you have capabilities where you can change the black box from Anduril to Raytheon or Honeywell or whatever to achieve the outcome, but allow the government to achieve outcomes. And the key for that are the interfaces, the operational interfaces, right? So that allows the companies to keep their secret sauce and the government to swap them out. And so that is where I think the focus needs to be. And that's what MOSA is about. It allows the government to focus on the outcomes that they want and choose the companies and technologies that are able to do it. And build redundancy, build kind of capacity, so you have multiple vendors producing systems that are compatible. So that's I would kind of turn it on its side a little bit on that.
Go ahead, Nathan.
I think just a practical example, maybe to encourage the crowd a little bit where this is working well, I think. The Army, shout out to the 4th ID and NGC2 out of Fort Carson. They are working to integrate intel, fires, logistics, all seamlessly together. And we're part of that team, and it's multiple companies. And I think to your point, in the software world, those interfaces are, we're able to actually construct them, and APIs make all of that possible. But you have these different companies. We're next to Anduril, Palantir, and it's all working together seamlessly with the Army data system. And so when something gets fired, it's then sent as a signal back, and it's tracked live, and people are making decisions not with, gone are the days of the magic wand of everybody starts with the full magazine, the full tank of fuel, all of our systems ready to go, and it reflects more of a reality, practicing as we intend to fight. And so I think that's a great example of the government maybe holding back from over-defining requirements, which could be a whole nother conversation. But I think when it articulates the desired outcome and then brings the right industry partners in together to work together, amazing things can happen.
Can I have a quick go back on that?
Go ahead, Kendall.
Because to that point, C2 for us is a huge topic right now. We've stood up a manufacturing facility in Camden for the Israeli Iron Dome missile. And so how do I integrate Iron Dome with existing launchers and radar detections? If I look at long-range air defense and medium-range air defense, we would like to be able to take and swap out. We've effectively done it with PAC-2 and PAC-3 missiles with Patriot. So you've got Lockheed missiles and Raytheon missiles that launch off of the same platform. In that context of being able to integrate different weapons onto a ground-based air defense system, I think is really critical. And that level of sharing data doesn't get into the IP piece of it or into the black box piece, but it creates interoperability for you all and the forward deploy forces. So that has been a huge, we're seeing it in Ukraine right now, where so many disparate systems have been deployed, and we've been working through with the Ukraine on how do they integrate those systems so that one radar system can see what the next radar system is doing. They're not deploying and using up multiple resources because the left hand doesn't see what the right hand's doing. So that C2 environment and the sharing of data that way to integrate systems, I think, is very, very critical at this juncture.
Can I ask a follow-up question of Nathan with
Yes.
the example? So where I think, and I'm glad that Jerry repositioned this to MOSA, because I think that's really the right way to sort of tackle that tough question. And I am also applaud the department for really doubling down on the MOSA concept, which is not new to acquisition reform. It's like a breathing new life into it this last fall with the acquisition reform strategy. So what I always found with MOSA was that everyone agreed in principle to the interface data would be critical, and that should be open. And in fact, it is statutorily, it is the modular open system interfaces are meant to be very open, and the government would have unlimited rights to those data. But the question, it always came up, where do you draw the interfaces? Because the department, so perhaps the OEM would want the interfaces to be, here, but the department thinks the interfaces are here. And that's where the rub comes, is how small is the black box and how many black boxes are there? And so in your example, and I know it's C2, so it's not exactly hardware, and it may not be the easiest example. As you guys are exploring this, and as the Army is, and I'm familiar with the Next Gen C2 program, as they're working through this, are you finding that there are arguments about where the interfaces are drawn? And what's the lesson to be learned from that? Like, how do we get out of that paper bag?
Yeah, it's a great question.
And if it's not applicable, to say it's not applicable.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer, but what I would say, the theme that we've seen is, again, the government articulating, hey, what do they need? And then there are a lot of conversations among the partners on how that should come together. But I think ultimately what you find is each member has a particular lane or part of the solution that they're pursuing. And so then I think stays away from does the government think it should live here or here, and more of a question of, well, what's the outcome that we desire? What's the interface in this portion of it? Okay, got it. Where is this data going to come from? So I think it's probably less applicable than in the hardware example, but I think that's a great point.
Well, and that's a good answer too, because that's essentially what Jerry was saying before, requirements reform. I mean,
That's right.
Instead of saying what something should be, just say what you want to do.
Correct.
And then let industry figure out amongst themselves how to do it.
That's right.
Well, your digital backbone idea of sharing and the licensing and the streaming IP rights could definitely do that. It would just depend upon what level is.
You said it.
So they're solving
I
questions.
agree with it.
Problems,
It's
right?
just,
Make it a
and it's how we would handle,
thing.
to the question where we actually set up international capabilities and international MROs, and we do the data. It's not just a U.S. centric. We have foreign operators of a lot of our equipment that we partner with to enable them to have depot repair capability in country, and that IP it's just a matter of discussion of how much. And what's the right level?
The previous panel talked a little about digital acumen, requiring the future workforce, right? Think Industry 4.0, 5.0, and things like that. Lots of questions are related to digital workforce. So this one is really related to OIB, but I'll try to weave it in here broadly. What would be your advice to the department in terms of hiring, training, and retaining workforce for digital infrastructure? And how are you doing it out there in your business?
Digital infrastructure. I think we're still doing that ourselves. We're still converting our own workforce, to the digital transformation. It's been one of the things that Honeywell as a corporation has been focused on, that digital transformation. I mean, it's as simple as our work instructions are visual and, digitized with multiple pictures and 3D when they're working a mechanical component, to utilization of a Honeywell internal AI tool. We're not allowed to use public source. We have to use our own internal AI tools. And so we've done a lot of advancement on that side for our coding and our engineer and our software. So when it comes to how do we enable the organic industrial base, I mean, start with your tech data packages. Could you guys please just digitize those? Maybe that's just a first ask, and then make sure that they're up to the latest and greatest standards and not the 1960s.
There's a question here specifically to Honeywell. So it says, for Honeywell, what education with industry options do you have available for your flight line avionics technicians and maintainers that could help with troubleshooting, conducting field, or intermediate level maintenance to repair LRUs?
We used to have a very large training academy for all of our customers and operators. It was actually here near the Sky Harbor Airport. And over the years, and particularly throughout COVID, that training technical package was outsourced. So if the individual who is really interested in that, I can get them the right details. It is something that is now primarily done through like our distribution centers. So if you're flying a Bombardier aircraft, you're going to go to the MRO, and they have a lot of the training that they would do for their folks. We no longer hold that at headquarters anymore.
Can I come
Alexis,
back to
you had a question to the digitalization.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the, how can we retain and
Hire,
upskill
train, or
our workforce in terms of the digital realm in which they are now
or to support
operating.
a digital infrastructure.
A thought occurred to me. I think we could probably make better use of some of the resources we have available to us in the department already. In other words, I sit on the board of directors of MXD, which is one of the manufacturing institutes, which is a public-private partnership that the department sponsors, or several of them, focused on each element of advanced manufacturing. I don't know that throughout the department, I don't know how much we know to go to them and utilize them as a resource for not only modernizing and digitally transforming our industrial operations, but also helping our workforce understand things like digital manufacturing, which is the one that I sit on. But they do workforce training for the industrial base. They'll work with OEMs' supply chains, because much of manufacturing in the industrial base, in the commercial industrial base, gets really small really quick. Like 74% of manufacturers are actually like 20 people or smaller mom and pop machine shops. Yeah. And so in the US, and so much has to be done to bolster and upskill all of that and to bring them into the modern era. And so those manufacturing innovation institutes, they support that ecosystem, but we can use them too in the department, and we can use them in whatever workforce training they're helping the manufacturing community in the commercial industrial base, we could be using in our organic industrial base. And so, and it's already a public-private partnership, so the DoD is already sponsoring it.
I think this is a very good question, but as an executive branch guy, it really pains me to ask it. How does industry look at and plan for the ever-changing priorities presented by the executive and legislative branches?
Wait, say it again?
How does industry look at and plan for ever-changing priorities presented by the executive branch and the Hill?
We hire your folks to be on our government relations teams and decipher for us.
I got to remember that, right? Recruitment bonuses. Any thoughts, Sarah?
You know, when we behave as a company, we act just like the government. We have a strategic plan. We have an annual operating plan. We define our priorities and our investments, billions of dollars, 6% goes back into RD&E. And when the priorities change, we generally will have to, do our internal trades of, okay, that's not as high a priority. That one can be slowed 3 months. Bring the internal funding over. So I don't know that we're all that different, other than we can do multi-year versus the 1-year reaction. A lot of our products will have a 5-year plan to production. We continually reinvest in existing products. And so that long-term strategic thinking is tempered to some degree in how reactive we are. But we do take that signal from the customer. I will say your DPAS system does that. If I have two conflicting needs, I go to the contracting officer and say, do you want this to go to production or do you want this to go to R&O? So we have that microcosm of it, but then we also behave in a longer-term strategic application.
It's the nature of the beast, you know. That's what this industry is. So, if companies, want to navigate it and be successful, they've got to understand it and be responsive and dynamic to address it. And if not, then maybe they want to consider doing something else, right? So it's just unfortunately the nature of the way the market is.
Back to multi-year, because we get a lot of votes on multi-year contracts. In reference to multi-year contracts, the general guidance is to preferentially use firm fixed price contracts. Is there an appetite for cost-plus contracting to establish a sustainable foundation and then integrate new firm fixed price contracts into them? Any contracting expertise here?
I mean, the department's acquisition strategy is talking about moving away from, the whole cost-plus world, moving, because, cost-plus is, where you have to have a separate accounting system, CAS, and that is what's made the defense business unique. And so moving firm fixed price has the opportunity for higher margins, if you're higher performance. So I think it all comes down to risk. And the reason why I have cost-plus contracts is when there's a lot of risk for the government and for companies, and it helps buy that down by, having, contracts that are not kind of, that are much more on mutual discovery activities. And so if you want more cost plus, you have smaller margins, you've got more compliance issues. It sort of depends on the outcomes the government wants.
I do think there's some middle ground on that, though, and what I see happening with us is we'll march down the firm fixed path on a multi-year contract, but how do you account for COVID, right? Nobody saw COVID coming, and what did that do to the pricing on everything? And so as you look at trying to predict the cost of goods 3 or 5 years down the road, what we are negotiating are terms for restructuring. And there are some triggers that would allow us to restructure in the middle of a multi-year firm fixed contract. And that is the path that we are going down. Where is the biggest risk for us, performance aside, but just in the cost of doing business and the impact to our supply base? We are trying to create opportunities to restructure those multi-year contracts in a firm fixed environment.
Okay. Alexis, you have led a number of reforms, including acquisition reform within the government. As the department undergoes this tremendous wave of acquisition reforms, what are 1 or 2 things Department of War should focus on to ensure changes stick, so we can have sticky change, enduring change?
Okay. I think there was a question earlier about, oscillation and trying to keep pace with, how does industry keep pace with the different legislative and executive branch initiatives. Okay, so reform is, and what we're in right now is a period of reform, and in any case, you're always having a pendulum that swings, right, back and forth. The pendulum's swinging, and I think we're in a great period of where in order to make, but it always does come back to the center, right? So that's probably how I would have answered that question if I had stepped in. In the situation we're in right now, there has been a great amount of structural changes, policy changes, operational changes in the system, in the acquisition system, and it's pushing the pendulum far to one end. And I think the intent here is that you push the envelope in a short period of time so that even if the system does start to normalize in the following years, it still does not go back to center. It doesn't go back to status quo. It goes to, you still have a net effect of change and improvement in the system. So I applaud that. What I think comes down to is implementation. And so all of this reform, I used to always say, all of it is really just a good idea until it's implemented. Like 80% of the work is actually in implementation, and that really comes down to personalities and the workforce and culture and all of these things. I think what we're finding is that with that much change, it's a lot to keep up with. And culture is fundamentally a people business. And so no amount of stroke of the pen policy or rousing speech, statement is going to change how people day to day think about things. It's a really simple equation. It's consistent communication from leadership plus time. So those two factors, and you have to put in the legwork and the time to energize people and bring them along and help them see the new way of doing things. So where the rubber's going to meet the road in this case, with all the changes that are happening right now, I think, is with the portfolio acquisition executives. So that new concept of pulling multiple elements of the large A acquisition system under one entity, one person at one office, and having that person be responsible for so many different functional elements. Like if you read the National Defense Authorization Act on the PAE and what all that person's supposed to do, they have quite a lot of the functional areas of expertise reporting to them. So that's where the rubber meets the road and where the cultural change is going to happen, I think, is how would those individuals, walk the walk and lead their people through this. And I think we're just now starting to see that. The Army was the first to put their PAEs out to restructure and reorganize. And so we're starting to see pieces get put together and stripped apart and put back together. And so, yet to be seen how the culture changes, but I think that they're now turning to, and I've talked to many of those PAEs, and they're now turning to what do we need to do to bring the culture together. And typically, this is always a problem because our system has so much turnover, not just in like depot commanders or unit commanders or PEOs, but political appointees. They're moving so frequently. It's very hard it sort of violates that equation I set up. Clear, consistent communication over time. The leaders change, they're communicating different priorities. So the goodness in what the acquisition strategy that was put out in November said was that the PAEs would have a tenure of 4 years plus 2 option years. So if my hunch is correct, that's the epicenter of where the culture will change, they have now the time afforded to them to be able to do it. So that's my hope. That's my half glass full, Vic.
Okay. Any additional thoughts from anyone? Nathan.
Sure.
What are we missing most when thinking about and planning supply chains for maintainers?
I think Kendall actually touched on this earlier, but the concept of the issue not really lying at the first tier. And I think what that means is you need deep visibility into your supplier base and a good understanding of where the common points of failure are or the overdependence is. I think one of the lessons learned from the munitions acceleration task force was that it was the SRM producers and suppliers that in fact were the choke point, not the primes. I think the acquisition transformation attempt to go direct to supplier I think is laudable. I think that if anybody doubts the administration's resolve on that, the $1 billion recent investment in SRM was, I think, one of those, putting real money in action where the words are. And I think if we're going to be able to have the connection between the data that we observe into action, again, it gets back to the ecosystem you need digitally to view that. But I think the insight into the depths of the supply chain, it's tier 3, 4, 5. It's not necessarily, everybody looks at the primes, but you all are all looking at the same folks that are buried a few layers underneath.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
So I take what you're saying, and I agree with it. But I want to take issue with the way you frame things at the beginning.
Sure.
I would not say Scrim is dead. I want us to say that Scrim is the answer, right? Because we've put so much money and efforts into supply chain illumination which is important. But the key is like, okay, we've got all these vulnerabilities. Which ones do we address? Right? And that is what SCRIM should be about. And and that should be the prioritization of investment. And you've seen that with SRMs. And I think you've got to see that in more places. So identify kind of where are those kind of choke points in the tier 2, 3, and 4, and then do the investments there. And that's what gets into like developing second sourcing, these kind of capabilities where you have more than one supplier. And you're seeing that is very central to the acquisition strategy. And interestingly, the SRM market, you've seen that as the demand increased. When I was in the building, we only had 2 suppliers of SRMs. And now there are like 5 or 6, lots of new ones, and it's going to shake out. But the demand helps drive these things. But the department has to prioritize and really help to say, okay, we've got all these risks. What are the most important in going after them?
If I could just, I think, point taken on the opening. I think my understanding of the way that SCRIM is currently being implemented is not that.
No,
so I think what you're saying is,
I think we agree on
the.
I think
solution.
we agree with.
Right.
We agree on the solution.
That's right.
The way that SCRIM is currently done is not the right way
That's
to
right.
do it. But no. So just be a little, just trying to.
I like it. I like
it up a little bit.
I like it.
It's getting juicy now. Go ahead.
I do want to maybe pull on the thread about the needing more sources, because right now we have several areas where we have government requirements on you must go to this supplier within our builds and within our restrictions. And so technically the government has taken ownership of this is your supply source, it's directed source. One of the challenges I would make is who within the government is overseeing those vulnerabilities where it's a single or perhaps 2 sources that's allowed, and maybe that second source is no longer in business thanks to COVID. Who's managing that?
Yeah.
And then the other piece becomes, if we need to do this ramp for resiliency and we need to grow, we're still stuck in the mindset of low-cost, technically acceptable bidding processes. So as a OEM, I can go bid you 5 suppliers, but your contracting authorities are only going to select the lowest price one who may be capacity constrained. And I may need 500 from supplier A, and I may need another 200 from supplier B at different prices. Our current contractual guidance to your contracting officers doesn't allow them to do that.
Thank you. All right, this is going to be rapid fire, all right? We have about 12 minutes left, 10 minutes left. So, Kendall, which production lines or materials are at the real risk of collapse today, and what is the honest timeline to fix them?
I don't think we have any production lines that are at risk of collapsing. It's the opposite. We're trying to figure out how do we ramp faster and grow. And I think, in all honesty, test equipment is probably the biggest constraint that we face within the company, because again, all of the primes are going to the same guys to build our test equipment. And so within the company, we're constrained on our own resources to build test equipment, and we're constrained in industry. So the growth path for me, AMRAAM, missile, Tomahawk, I mean, we talked about munitions acceleration, right? The Department of War identified 12 critical munitions that they want to significantly surge. 6 of those are Raytheon programs. So I'm now trying to surge 6 production lines simultaneously. I can run multiple shifts, I can reconfigure factory footprint, but ultimately I need test equipment. So test equipment is a big constraint, and test equipment obsolescence is a big constraint for us as well. That oftentimes is the first thing that gets kicked down the road when we come to the US government. We talk about we need to modernize, or we have constraints. We don't want to be buying parts off of eBay to be fixing test equipment. So how do we modernize our test equipment? That is not a quick process. So I think in general, when we look at risk, we internally always talk about test equipment because the volume of tests that we do is significant, and it is always the first bottleneck in production.
There was an effort to try to digitalize testing. How's that going? Is the department actually digitalizing?
So I thought I didn't want to speak up when we were talking about digitization earlier, but yes, I think we have mountains of test data that historically just becomes mountains of data. And so how do you take data and turn that into actionable item? And so the ability to, the predictive analytics has been a huge focus for us. How do we take that test data, turn it into predictive analytics, use it to analyze where do I have redundant testing that I don't need to have happen, where am I seeing a trend where I could be at fault for failing hardware down the road, and how do I mitigate that before I reach the failures? I don't know if that's kind of what the point you're getting to, but for us, the digitization of the data coming off of test is a valuable resource in trying to optimize our test strategy.
Any?
I was just thinking that the theory is it speeds up testing so much if you can run digital tests and you don't have to always do it in the physical sense. And we now have the capability to do it, but we're not really integrating that capability in the department.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of that
such.
test is thermal cycling. How do you digitize thermal cycling? You know, I mean, at the end of the day, we have digitized and automated at every opportunity, but we are still low volume, high complexity, and some of that it takes an operator to be assessing and analyzing and real time adjusting.
Sir, what is one manufacturing capability we must repatriate immediately to avoid strategic vulnerability?
So one of the biggest capabilities within the U.S. that actually exited probably over the last 10, 20 years has been our forgings. I don't know that most people are aware of, there was an article in National Defense in December 2024 that cited that 241 forging facilities have closed in the last 20 years due to international pressure. So obviously, department policies regarding tariffs, but is one way to drive more back into the U.S. The problem is we're not standing up those entities to do that work. Very critical that things such as tax incentives, local state incentives for those forging capabilities actually go hand in hand. So it's not just forcing work back into the U.S., but ensuring that we have the people. I think it was something like a loss. I think there's only like 35,000 people that are technically employed in forging, which is roughly a 50% reduction from where it was 20 years ago.
Thank you. Anyone? Any comments on?
Castings and forgings is a top 3 for us as well. I would add raw materials.
Yeah.
And semiconductors, electronic components to that as well.
I mean, yeah, these have been focus areas for the past almost decade for under consecutive administrations. These kind of areas, and they are chronic. The key for me is that we can't fix all of them at once, and it's sort of like the ones that are kind of where you have the most kind of vulnerabilities with respect to China are the ones you want to address first.
So, I mean, here in Arizona, of course, TSMC and CHIPS Act and expansion has helped on the electronic side. I keep waiting for the day when we do it on the mechanical side as well. Yeah. So, somebody want to tell me where that bill is?
Okay. And just for in the interest of time, as we close out, Alexis, any parting comments writ large with respect to production as deterrents? How do we accelerate? How do we speed up? How do we really drive sticky change with acquisition transformation strategy, et cetera? Workforce, any of those kind of things? And let's just plant the seed for you too.
So an overarching comment, you mentioned a lot of things. There's a lot of stuff inside. There's a lot of good stuff inside acquisition reform right now, coming out of both the Hill and the department. I think what's important when it comes to implementation will be remaining laser focused on the first principles of what we're trying to accomplish. Because when you're working many different angles of different bank shots, of lots of different comprehensive solutions, sometimes these things can kind of butt up against each other, and you have to make sure that that what we're trying to do in one area complements another area. For example, we were talking about IP earlier, and making sure that in gaining access to IP, we're also not being counterproductive in other areas, like trying to increase the number of commercial or new entrants to the industrial base, and trying to work with, and it's obviously a stated goal to work with more private capital-backed companies and to buy more commercial items. Well, what you do in IP can sometimes thwart those goals if it's not done delicately with a sort of focus on the overarching objectives for the whole system of acquisition. So that's, I guess, one parting comment that comes to mind is just making sure that all of these things march toward the same area.
Thank you. Nathan?
Well, first, thank you again for the opportunity here, and thanks to everyone in the room who's attacking this mission into A&S. We all know that sustainment, whether it's material readiness, maintenance, has always kind of gotten the can kicked down the road and been underfunded. I'm hopeful that now there is a little bit of a changing wind here, and I know that Undersecretary Duffy has prioritized contested logistics, obviously, the fight, the potential fight in the Pacific. I think there's a strategic spectrum here of where sustainment really plays in. And so I think that goes all the way from credible deterrence in the Pacific all the way over to the nuclear deterrent. Some of you might be surprised to know that the Minuteman III missile been around since President Kennedy, and we're still needing that and counting on that as part of our deterrence. I think ultimately we have to be able to translate the needs to the industrial base. The NGC2 example I gave, I think, being a good example of how that can happen. That needs to happen at scale. I think both ends of that deterrence depend on our ability to orchestrate across the supply chains in the department. And ultimately, that's on all of us in this room to help figure out.
Thank you. Jerry?
So I would say two things. Number one, I think what we need to do is we need to stop talking to the industrial base in segments in terms of like, non-traditionals are good, traditionals are bad, small businesses are innovation and so on. It's one industrial base. And so we need all companies, all shapes and sizes to succeed and perform to accomplish the mission. And so we need to focus on the industrial base overall. Because things like, we did some analysis, if you look at non-traditional versus traditional firms, 93% of the firms in the industrial base are actually non-traditional, which is kind of silly, right? Because if that's the case, then why have this term? So I think we need to focus on the industrial base. The other point I want to make was on process versus outcomes. And you were very clear in your questioning, and the Secretary was very clear in his speech about we need to focus on outcomes versus process. And we need to keep that in mind, particularly folks in the department, because the department is not a profit and loss center. And so it is very process focused, from the directives to instructions to you name it. That's what we live off of. And so, but you have to break that mindset. And I have to give you two examples. There's a tremendous focus on other transactions authorities and how they're the elixir and they're going to get and so on. We have no way to measure how many where OTAs go. The OTAs are for prototyping, right? They do have now follow-on production OTs, but we have no way to measure how many of those succeed and move to that. So if you want to measure something, measure that. Likewise, small business innovation research, that has doubled from $3 to $6 billion over the last decade. That's great. We have no way to measure how many SIPR projects turn into actual programs of record, except by going individually. So you want to measure outcomes, start with those things. Anyway.
Clearly hit a hot button right there. Kendall?
I see the red light. I know we're out of time, so I'll just say, being on the defense industrial base side, Raytheon has invested internally. We've done the assessment of the fragility of our supply base. We know where our biggest vulnerabilities are. We have identified where we can go create some relief valves, and we are sitting and waiting on those multi-year contracts to go surge and support you all with increased manufacturing capability. We are positioned and we are ready, and we are waiting now for the next step, which is funding to go do so.
Thank you. Sarah, I'll let you close out on that.
Well, only thing on that comment is obviously we do self-invest. I mean, I can't even count the number of programs where Honeywell's done the investment and then perhaps the government changed their mind. Anybody around from Comanche? Billions of dollars invested that may or may not have proceeded. And so I think that as a commercial company, we will continue to do that and continue to advance our technologies for the broader aerospace and defense industry applications. And so I thoroughly welcome some of the contracting changes that are coming down, the administrative policies that are coming down, and I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be part of our industry, and it's one of the telling points I do to recruit new workforce.
Yeah. So to the panelists, I really appreciate a very sincere and honest conversation. It was very candid. It's a necessary conversation. To you, the audience, you have heard firsthand the complexities, the friction, the opportunities involved in reorienting our entire industrial base, our enterprise, for strategic competition. The challenges are not theoretical. These are real, and the solutions are not simple. So this morning I said it was time to move from declaration to execution. The discussion we just had is the beginning of that execution. It has laid bare the fault lines in our current system, and it's identified the hard work that all of us need to do to get this done. But we cannot admire the problem. We must now equip you, our partners in industry, government, and from allies and our allies and partners with the tools to be able to solve this. Hopefully the acquisition transformation strategies lays the foundation to get after that. The questions raised today on this stage are not rhetorical questions. They have real answers grounded in real authorities. The Hill we talked about authorities, appropriations, et cetera, and the real funding that the department is deploying right now. You saw the slide earlier with all the wins that we have done in just this last year. We can do this. So for those of you who are ready to move from the what into the now and how, I want to draw your attention to a critical breakout session this afternoon, mobilizing resources, strategic pathways for defense industrial base resilience. It's at 3:30 p.m. in room 124 Alpha Bravo. My team will be there, others will be there. It's not a brief. This is for you to directly engage with our teammates. And there were some questions related specifically to IBAS and castings and forgings and leveraging IBAS and DPA, OTA. I didn't ask those questions specifically because you need to go to that room and you need to ask the experts that are sitting at the front table there those questions because they will have the answers, not the folks up here. So again, I really appreciate the candidness that you've shown. I appreciate your time. The work is hard. The stakes are non-negotiable. Let's get to it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramdes, and to our panelists. That was a great panel, and I appreciate it. And Dr. Ramdes, thanks for the plug on the breakout sessions this afternoon. Reminder, service town halls, a whole lineup of breakout sessions this afternoon. And this evening, of course, we have the awards banquet. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all there. And a final plug as you walk to the doors, December 8 to 11, Fort Lauderdale, the next maintenance symposium. We'll see you there. Thank you all.
Thank you.